Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the New Books Network. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today my guest is Geoffrey Levin. Geoffrey is the author of Our Palestine Question, Israel and American Jewish Dissent, 1948 to 1978, published by Yale University Press in 2023. This is a new history of the American-Jewish relationship with Israel, focusing on its most urgent and sensitive issue, the question of Palestinian rights. American Jews began debating Palestinian rights issues even before Israel's founding in 1948. So the author, Geoffrey Levin, recovers the voices of American Jews who, in the early decades of Israel's existence, called for an honest reckoning with the moral and political plight of Palestinians. These now forgotten voices, which include an aid worker turned academic with Palestinian Sephardic roots, a former Yiddish journalist, anti-Zionist Reform rabbis and young left-wing Zionist activists, felt drawn to support Palestinian rights by their understanding of Jewish history, identity, and ethics. They sometimes worked with the mainstream American Jewish leaders who feared that ignoring Palestinian rights could foster antisemitism, leading them to press Israeli officials for reform. But Israeli diplomats viewed any American Jewish interest in Palestinian affairs with these suspicions, provoking a series of quiet confrontations that ultimately kept Palestinian rights off the American Jewish agenda up to the present era. But before we delve into all of this, first things first, Jeff, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Roberto.
So just to kick off, can you tell us something about yourself and the origins of this book?
Sure. Well, I started my PhD program really interested in diplomatic studies, U.S.-Israel stuff, and intended to write something on that level. But, you know, when you're living in New York, the best archives around are the American Jewish related archives. And so I was taking a class my first year with Professor Hillel Cohen, who was visiting from Hebrew University, and about, you know, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I was curious, could I write something archival? And, you know, there's no diplomatic files. You know, there weren't Israeli state archive files online back then, but I could walk down the street and see what American Jewish groups were doing in response to the military government issues, restrictions on Arab citizens of Israel. And very easily, as a first-year PhD student, I found really fascinating stuff about how the leaders of the American Jewish Committee were going and confronting Ben-Gurion and studying the issue. And so I really went into this as someone interested in diplomacy, someone interested in Israel, Palestine, not as an American Jewish historian. And I think you can kind of see it grow out of that, a very source-focused project. And I sort of jumped into the field of American Jewish history as time went on.
And we must say that the field of American Jewish history is complex, to say the least. As a person that didn't know much, when I first moved to America, I made the point to try to read American Jewish history. And you mentioned a number of those works in your book. And I guess I had one very limited, a sort of a tunnel vision. Later on, I was able to make more reading. But I had the sense that there was one narrative and that was the dominant one. Now, had this book been published in a different historical context, it would have been certainly controversial and debated in many ways. However, the very fact that it has been published in a post-October 7 world, your book has become central in the understanding, at least in my view, of the history of American Jews and their complex relations with the State of Israel and Zionism. Can you talk about the general outlook of the book, its goals, and also, give us a sense of the previous literature on this topic?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'd say the book sort of does three big things. One is it shows that, American Jewish debates and engagement and conflicted views go back not to the 70s or not just the past 10 years, but back to 1948 about Palestinians, about Israel. There's this idea that this is something new, that this generation or the 1960s generation suddenly broke with American Jewish past, and in terms of being troubled by some of these issues, Israeli policies. And I show no, there's American Jews who are deeply involved with Palestinian rights issues from 1948, even beforehand. So doing that is a basic service to, the field, considering there's been like little to no literature on that, and a lot of the people I write about. I also show kind of why these conversations didn't break out and become higher in American Jewish discourse. So a second thing I do is really highlight the role of state actors, especially Israeli diplomats, in pushing against any sort of public engagement with Palestinian rights issues, highlighting it even in not very ways that shouldn't have been that provocative, but they really sort of wanted to advance a specific narrative. And a third really relevant highlight, and I didn't push this as enough, I think, as a central message of the book, is the historicization of the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which is this sort of arc that goes through these chapters on the American Jewish Committee, especially chapter 4, and shows sort of, it wasn't the case that leading American Jewish organizations consider anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. I do my best in the book and in some related articles to show how that went about happening. So obviously these are very related to things that are going on now. Everything and everyone's feelings are a lot more intense. But it's, I see, 10 news pieces a day that just kind of, that my book relates to the history and backstory of these things. So, everything's more intense right now. And obviously I've been working on this project since 2014, essentially, and I couldn't have imagined it coming out at such a challenging time and terrible time for everyone.
We will talk about later the question of diplomacy, but also the questions of the campuses in America and their relations with your question of anti-Semitism and pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian support. But I guess for readers who are not familiar with that, this discourse seems to be just a contemporary issue, but you point out in the book that really goes back the 1950s. So it is a fascinating conversation that the media today seems to portray as something that just is happening now, but the reality is that it's been going on for decades. So as I said, we'll talk about that later because I think is a very important point to unpack. Now, I want to go back to the structure of the book. And so while discussing the sources used, could you also start introducing the main characters in some of your organizations that you are discussing in your book?
Yes, it's a very person-focused book. I really like highlighting the stories of people and people that most people haven't heard of. So the first 5 chapters really sort of have a main character or two, and those chapters are sort of pre-67 or through 67. The last chapter is the 70s, where there's a huge number of people, some who are featured, but there aren't a ton of people engaging with Palestinian rights at the time, so I can engage and get in these stories. So the first person and kind of main character is a guy named Don Peretz. He's born in Baltimore, but his father is a Sephardic Jerusalem born Zionist who fled Ottoman Palestine during World War I. And he is, I'll get into him more, but he's a pacifist-oriented person who studies at Hebrew University and ends up volunteering to help Palestinians who are displaced in 48 and works for the American Jewish Committee. So he's sort of, and later is involved in basically every sort of initiative to study or deal with Palestinian rights during this period because he writes the first dissertation on Palestinians. A second sort of major figure is a man named Fayez Sayegh, who's born in the same year as Peretz, 1922. And he's someone who I think far too few people in Palestinian studies know about. I highlight sort of this understudied, almost totally understudied period where he's leading American sort of pro-Arab rhetoric as the chief spokesman for the Arab League in the U.S. And sort of all these sort of Arab, the pro-Arab rhetoric is sort of the background to the American sort of Jewish initiatives related to this. Another figure is William Zuckerman, who's a former Yiddish journalist who writes sort of the most outspoken newspaper, a Jewish newspaper called the Jewish Newsletter in the 50s about this, about dealing with Israel critically. Another person in chapter 3, a number of leading figures in the American Jewish Committee are highlighted, especially a man named James Marshall, who is the son of Louis Marshall, one of the most important figures in American Jewish history. He's very interested in trying to address Arab civil rights in Israel. Elmer Berger, who is a bit more well known, is the sort of main figure in chapter 5. And he is a anti-Zionist rabbi of Reform background. And there's a number of other figures too, sort of on the left, coming out of 67, Norton Mezvinsky, Chomsky I mentioned. And then in the last chapter, I get into a number of people, fortunately some of them women, like Aviva Cantor, like Sharon Rose, like Ellen Siegel, at a time when there's a lot more people engaging with these issues after 67 war.
So let's start with Don Peretz. Don Peretz is a fascinating figure, and as you mentioned, his father is a Jerusalemite that managed to escape Jerusalem at the outset of World War I. And he's a fascinating character associated with the ACJ, and we're going to talk about this organization later. And he was a critic of Israel, a non-Zionist, which is a very interesting definition. And he was interested, as you mentioned, in the question of Palestinian refugees. Perhaps it's worth mentioning that since 1948, the Israeli government engaged in an intense war against the possibility for Palestinians to return. And as we know, this has been some sort of a common policy ever since. So let's start from Don Peretz. Can you elaborate more on this character?
Yeah, so his mother's Ashkenazi American Jew. His father came to this country only a few years before he's born, friendly with Henrietta Zold, his father. Anyway, he gets very inspired by pacifism. He serves as a non-combatant in Okinawa in World War II, and he's inspired by Judah Magnus and Martin Buber. So he actually uses the GI Bill to study at Hebrew University from 1946 to 1948. Because of Magnus. And when he's there, he gets super inspired by Zionism initially in 46, 47. But then when war breaks out, he's extremely conflicted. He doesn't like what's happening. He doesn't like the rhetoric. He's, very binationalist oriented. A dramatic, almost Forrest Gump-like story in terms of meeting Begin and all these other figures. But anyway, he leaves, and then he comes back in 49 to volunteer with the Quaker organization, the American Friends Service Committee, which is active in helping refugees, mostly in Gaza, but also internally displaced Palestinians who become citizens of Israel later in the Galilee in northern Israel. So he spends most of 1949 as probably the only American Jew who's volunteered to spend it's like 7-8 months of his life helping displaced Palestinian Arabs. And he leaves in late 49 because he wants to study this issue seriously. He's not an anti-Zionist. By this point, he's pretty unhappy with how Zionism has turned out. But he writes the first dissertation on the topic, and he, meets the Mufti in Cairo. He studies in Beirut. He goes and he studies back in Israel, and he's really trying to do what he views as objective work. So we look at someone who's critical of Israel, but he's not someone who's public. He views him in his role primarily as a scholar to see how, if it's possible to, address the Palestinian refugee issue. And the American Jewish Committee, again, which is at this time in the 50s, the most politically influential American Jewish organization. It's not the most popular. It considers itself non-Zionist, which, is supportive of Israel, but not not supportive of the notion of Jewish nationalism. So they're very conflicted about these issues because they consider themselves to be, this is AJC, a human rights organization, a pro-American organization, and they're trying to be, in certain ways, neutral. And they also feel that pro-Arab sort of taking up of these issues and the unresolved conflict is bad for American Jews. It's bad for anti-Semitism. So they hire Peretz to create a Palestinian Refugee Relief Initiative, interfaith thing, and they announce it. It's not about right of return, but it infuriates Israeli diplomats. They don't feel American Jews should really be discussing this in a way that they're not really handling. That American Jews shouldn't have an independent opinion on these issues. And so it gets tabled, and there's pressure to fire Peretz. And they, don't fire him initially. They have him do other things for a long time. But then his book's coming out, and he sends it to, the guy, Israeli diplomat in New York, a guy whose name happens to be Yaakov Morris, father of Benny Morris. So I have this letter from Benny Morris's dad, who's just very unhappy about this first book about Palestinian refugee issues, which doesn't even, get far in the surface. And Peretz ultimately gets pushed out because of that. So that's kind of the first chapter. He's involved sort of behind the scenes in all these other chapters of the book because he's sort of the senior figure. He's, again, a leading scholar. He's trying to deal with this issue in what he views as an objective, humanistic way. Working for the American Jewish Committee. He's involved with this Brera, which we'll talk about. He's friends with anti-Zionists, even though he never calls himself an anti-Zionist. So he's I open up with his life story, which has never been covered. He's mostly unknown outside of being a scholar in the field, who was active at SUNY, and author of a textbook that's pretty was well known.
As you just said, Peretz is a figure that becomes a liminal figure, like somehow very important, but also disconnected with major narratives about American Jews. And so I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about the oppositions against Peretz, because I think this is what gives them agency, and it becomes very important. And that can highlight the emergence of various forms of control, shall we say, implemented by Israeli officials in the country and abroad. And I was wondering if you could also say why Israeli officials opposed almost any form of criticism coming from American Jews as early as 1948, essentially.
Yeah, I've always been so interested in this period, the 50s, which is most of the book's really about the 50s, because you don't know how things will go. Like, it's so new for American Jews that the state exists. It's so new, they don't even really understand much about the refugee problem. They really don't understand what life is like for Arabs living in Israel after 48. American foreign policy, it's not clear if they're going to have this special relationship with Israel. The Eisenhower administration really wants a strong relationship with Nasser, which is sort of why the CIA is involved in this story as well. But look, this is a time when the American Jewish community was especially important for Israel. Israel needs great funding to absorb all these migrants from Jews making Aliyah, or whatever term you want to use, from Arab countries and from other countries. Israel doesn't know how Washington's going to go. It's not receiving the support it would. So Israel doesn't know if there's going to be strong international pressure to have partial. I don't think there's any seriousness about full refugee return, but partial. This is something that the Truman administration, Eisenhower administration, thought was quite reasonable for X number of refugees to be returned in the context of, I wouldn't say quite a full peace deal, but in terms of alleviating the Arab-Israeli conflict. So everything's more intense in certain ways in terms of the uncertainty. We sort of know how the American-Israel relationship went from the 60s onward, but not a lot of people understand how fraught and uncertain things are, or really how deep and how confusing Israel's creation is for even American Zionists who really aren't sure if they're in a hierarchical relationship with Israeli diplomats or when they didn't used to be. So it's a very, there's so many interesting questions after 48 that people haven't looked at scholars haven't looked at as much as I think they should have, or until I guess I am. Others are too right now. Matt Berkman, Marjorie Feld, others.
Let's now talk about the other character, William Zuckerman, who was certainly a bigger figure than Peretz, at least in terms of audience. He was very open in his opposition to Zionist, particularly the revisionist form of Zionism, which he called a fascist organization, essentially. And he equally acknowledged what later new historians call the culpability of Israel in relation to the Palestinian refugees, which is interesting that you can find early example of what the new historians, Manny Morris being one of them, later on, went into the archives and find out. Why did Zuckerman become a problem in American Jewish history? Because this was my perception, that he became a problem, not just what he was saying, but also himself as a figure.
Yeah, no, he's a public. He's very different than Peretz. He's born in 1885 in Russia. He comes over to Chicago when he's 15. He becomes a Yiddish journalist. He spends time in Europe, a chunk of his career in Europe. And while it's pretty clear why people haven't written about Don Peretz in American Jewish studies, this is someone who's publishing as an established figure throughout from 48 to 61. This fairly decently circulated a publication called the Jewish Newsletter. So he switches to English in 1948. He was long skeptical of especially revisionist Zionism, which he calls fascist in 1934. So we're not even talking, we're talking early. But he doesn't call himself anti-Zionist in 48. He feels like he wants to engage with these issues critically, and he has this mission of this basically one-man operation to sort of become the place where people can talk about the tough issues related to Israel, whether that's the role of Yiddish and Israel's sort of policies, which are not helpful to Yiddish, which matters to him, Israel's policies toward its non-Jewish citizens, toward lots of Jews, toward the Palestinian refugees. And he just feels like he's not a super ideological person, and he feels like these are serious issues that need to be discussed. So he's publishing not just this magazine, but he's been syndicated throughout the country. I can't really tell you how many American Jewish publications published him, but regularly in sort of Boston and Philadelphia, and I'm sure other major Jewish news sources. And again, this is a time when it's not clear what American Jews' position should be. In 49, do you just follow what Israel's saying? Do we have our own autonomy, or is it a problem? And Zionists, aren't really sure what to do about him, because he's not hyper anti-Zionist at this time in these publications. And ultimately, it's Israeli diplomats who push him out. Tell the Zionists, okay, actually, your job, the Zionist leaders, is to make him not be published so much. And so he's super upset about this. There's these kind of quiet campaigns, and I just looked through Israeli diplomatic files on this, and it was actually an easy chapter to write because they just had files on him, and they thought he was an issue. And so I don't know why he really isn't covered much before. Again, he's pushing against the grain, but he's writing and still having an audience, even though it's more limited, until he dies in 1961. Again, a lot of non-Jews and sort of Jewish intellectuals are reading him, even when he becomes sort of sidelined from the mainstream.
Let's now talk about the American Jewish Committee. So this is the organizations that you have been discussing throughout the book the most. There are a few others, but certainly this is very central to your narrative. So you gave us some basic information earlier, and I was wondering if you can now elaborate on its origins and particularly on its ideology. And perhaps it's worth mentioning the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, which, at least in America, and for those that would adhere to this statement, declared that the Jews are no longer a nation,
but in a religious community. And so I was also wondering if you can explain this, because there's always a bit of a confusion, particularly amongst the non-Jewish populations, about this dichotomy, nation and religious community.
Yeah, so American Jewish community around the turn of the century, there's this more established Central European American Jewish community who has come, Reform Judaism has become predominant. And they sort of feel like the path forward is integration. It's, changing Judaism. It's understanding Judaism as a religion, not a nation, not a people. And, rabbis articulate that in 1885. And the people who found this American Jewish community in 1906 are sort of elites, largely Reform Jews who have that opinion. But throughout this period from 1880s to the 1920s, there's this huge number of Jews coming in from Eastern Europe. The American Jewish community is founded to aid them sort of in Russia, as well as in the United States, and to combat anti-Semitism here and abroad. It's sort of this first really American Jewish, the longest existing really American Jewish advocacy group, and there's many. And, they're not, a lot of the Eastern Europeans are more interested in Zionism or socialism, and that's really not their thing. They consider themselves non-Zionist. So, they're the type of organization that'll call itself, or would call itself, very non-ideological. And of course, there's no such thing as being non-ideological. They're sort of more liberal, integrationist in their ideas. The solution to the Jewish problem, for Zionism is Israel, is migration there. For them, it's and Jewish nationalism. For them, it's America. It's becoming a full citizen who's in home country like America, who's not different than the neighbors, except they go to temple on Saturday instead of church, or maybe even on Sunday, or instead of church on Sunday. So they're sort of embraced sort of classic versions of American liberalism, and Zionism doesn't quite fit. But they are an international Jewish rights organization, and so they find a way to be non-Zionist, but support institutions like the Hebrew University, which they consider apolitical, and so they find these, quote, apolitical ways to help the Yishuv and Jewish institutions. But Zionism at the time is much more ideological than we think about it now, and they're not sort of signed on to this deep ideological package of Jewish nationhood. They think it's a threat to American Jewish loyalty to the United States. And I think they both believe in that idea, and I think they also are concerned about anti-Semitism. So some of its leaders are anti-Zionist into the 40s. But when push comes to shove and Israel's moving forward, they back it. And they're kind of outliers in some ways, in that they're just so into this non-Zionist message. But a lot of Jewish organizations didn't call themselves Zionists during this time period, because Zionism meant something much more robust than it does now. Now it's just like Zionism and pro-Israelism in American discourse are considered more or less the same. Back then, they felt there was non-Zionist, like not signing on to what Ben Gurion would say is because they're not making Aliyah, So they're grappling with these tough questions about what Israel's creation means for American Jews. What's the proper way of dealing with it? What's the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? And obviously, these are huge questions that they have to deal with, and it's not settled, the day after Israel's created. And this is actually a lot of what the book's about. I have this sort of 3-chapter arch, one with Peretz, with them going to Israel and trying to push Ben Gurion to lift restrictions and liberalize the approach toward quote Israeli Arabs, and then I have this chapter which they're engaging with Fayez Sayegh and these questions of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So again, they're the biggest organization. Half the book is kind of dealing with them, and because they're also the most politically influential group at the time, with connections in Washington, even though they're not as popular as some other groups amongst American Jews.
So I want to ask about a couple of things here. First of all, how did the AJC, so the American Jewish Committee, looked at the Palestinians, particularly those in Israel post-1948? And perhaps also can tell us a little bit more about what happened to the committee. How did eventually disappear from sort of the constellation of other American Jewish organizations?
Yeah, so, they go in 49 to Israel as leaders, and I think a lot of things are unresolved, and they're not that tuned in. And so, I think for the American Jews in general, a lot of times, the idea is that things will be temporary. So there are restrictions on Arabs who remain in Israel after 48, but it's viewed as temporary, and it doesn't really come up as that big of a thing in the early 50s. But then Arab groups and other Christian, including a CIA-backed pro-Arab groups, are talking about Israel's restrictions against Arabs. Kafr Qasim, a massacre of Israeli Arabs happens in 56. And so it's something they can't ignore. And so when it's something they can't ignore, they have to deal with it because, okay, they talk about liberal integration. They're talking about equal rights for all citizens in America, of Jews in other countries like Morocco and Russia, Soviet Union. And so okay, what do they have to say about this? And so it's not something that they're eager to approach, but once it's on the sort of national discourse, they have to have a position on it. And they don't believe in just taking on a position that just like, okay, let's call up the Israeli diplomat. What should we say about this? Not everyone there. And so they try and figure out what we're doing. What are we saying? We need to talk to Ben-Gurion, change the policies. And so they deal with this. And what I think, and they don't really have a lot of success, and they do fold to certain pushback and lack of responsiveness. But what I really think happens is that America becomes much more of a pro-Israel place in the late 50s and the 60s. And so they're not as concerned about anti-Semitism from American Christians and the right. And they're also sensitive to the fact that with movies like Exodus coming out, with Israel becoming more of a part of American Judaism, that more and more American Jews, don't like critics, even if they don't label as anti-Semitic. They don't like criticism of Israel. They expect Jewish organizations to deal with it. And so they're kind of dealing, things kind of fade because of stuff from below. And even more after 67, when there's sort of this huge celebration of Israel. But there's a gradual story too. I think until now, so much has been saying, okay, 48 happens, American Jewish groups change. Oh, 67 happens, everything changes then. And, influenced by a lot of people who've been studying this period in American Jewish history and Palestinian history, I show this is a very complicated time and that things are being processed. So they end up becoming pretty much indistinguishable on these questions from other groups really after 67. They stop calling themselves non-Zionist. It's never like they announce it. But basically on their material, letterhead, publications, they often say non-Zionist and then just kind of disappears after the 67 war. So it's all very quiet and subtle story, and that's sort of why it hasn't been told so much, and why I have a book that deals with actually very quiet, small, nuanced issues.
As they say, the devil is in the details, and I think those are very important when you deal with certain publications. Let's move ahead, and you mentioned a myth which is very common, and many Americans, like many others around the world, would have believed that Palestine was an empty land for a people without a land. But many organizations and individuals, including Fayez Sayegh, and we're going to talk about him, himself a Palestinian, fought back against these kinds of myths. And so could you start talking about Sayegh and why he was feared by so many Jewish organizations and Israeli officials to the point that they staged campaigns against him?
Yeah, the pre-67 history of sort of pro-Palestine discourse in this country, in history, has been in America, this is kind of one of the few stabs at my work. There's a few other scholars of Arab American history and other, but there hasn't been much written on that, and that's because there's not a ton. There's some Arab American and there's Arab American historians who've done great work, but there's stuff happening in the 30s of Arab American groups, and then 48 happens, and there's some Arab state-sponsored stuff, and it all sort of falls apart when Israel's created. And so going into the 50s, there's very little pro-Palestine, people highlighting Palestinian Arabs. And Fayez Sayegh is his father's Syrian. He was born in Syria. His mother's Palestinian. He grew up in Tiberias to a family of really great scholars. His brothers, including him, became great scholars, studied at American University of Beirut, and is doing his PhD at Georgetown when, 48, the Nakba happens. So he gets his PhD. He's a stateless person, and he gets involved with some Arab diplomatic legations in advocating for Arab causes, Arab national causes, not just Palestinian stuff. And it gets a big platform by this group called American Friends of the Middle East, which is this sort of seems like a Christian pro-Arab group, but is really sponsored by the CIA. I mean, it's also the people leading it, were genuine in their convictions, but it's a really interesting footnote in American Middle East policy. But ultimately, he is emerging in the early to mid 50s as the most articulate and active Arab voice on all these issues. And so when the Arab League wants to open its information office, so the counterpoint to Israel's Merkaz HaHasbara, in New York, the Arab League Secretary General has him set it up. He's not given the job of director. He becomes the sort of deputy to someone who's not very good at his job, who goes on medical leave. And so for a year during the 56 war, he is the acting director of the Arab League's information project, and he is extremely articulate. He's tireless despite he has a serious heart issue, and is going on these insane tours of the U.S. and is meeting with journalists, and he is by far the person who is talking about Arab issues, including Palestinian issues, they call him the Arab Ibn. Some of his people who is sort of the Arab equivalent of Abba Ibn. He is accused of anti-Semitism by the ADL. And he says, look at my material. I don't have anything that's anti-Semitic. Jews are this, Zionists are that. And he says, but you know who doesn't distinguish between Jews and Zionists and Israelis is Ben Gurion. Look at this quote from him. And so, and this is on the radio, and he's saying national radio basically, and it alarms the AJC, and they go to Ben Gurion and trying to get him to change what he's saying again. This is constantly goes up, and they meet with him, and the leaders of the American Jewish Committee meet with him to try and hammer out these issues, and they don't think he's anti-Semitic, even though he's very anti-Zionist and pro-Arab. But again, over the course of the next few years, they have to deal with the grassroots, the fact that, even though he's not anti-Semitic, the stuff that he's saying critical of Israel is not good for Jews because Jews are pro-Israel. And so in chapter 4, you have this story of people who, a lot of these people I think are, we can say they're well-meaning. Sayegh, I mean, I don't know his personal views, but he's trying not to say anything anti-Semitic. He's trying not to be accused of anti-Semitism. The AJC people are trying not to accuse him of anything that he's not doing. But ultimately, they sort of come around to the American Jewish consensus that, this is something we need to act about. These American Jewish organizations ultimately take up the role of defending Israel, but they don't view that as part of their purview immediately. So when does, the AJC, the ADL, other groups start feeling like their job isn't just defending American Jews, it's also defending Israel? And this is sort of the quiet shift into that that I tell in this chapter.
Perhaps taken out of, your book, but do you think could be this also the moment where American politics began, to get closer to Israel than before? Because you mentioned in the book, and we know historically that not necessarily this relationship between Israel and America has always been so tight. And I was wondering if your read of this particular moment in Jewish history can also be connected to American politics at large.
Oh, definitely. I'm a Salim Yaqub, Melanie McAllister, Amy Kaplan, all these scholars of U.S. Middle East, either culture or diplomacy, influenced me a lot. And they all go hand in hand. This is the moment, again, Eisenhower has high hopes for Nasser and then gives up on Nasser, and then there's flirtation, certain flirtations. And so that's influences American policy, and things go hand in hand with culture. And so there's all this is happening in like 56, 57, 58. There's this kind of roller coaster period. And I could tell my story ignoring that. It wouldn't make much sense without these big picture things, but that explains why this is this period of great debate on these issues. And there ends up, as we get in the Kennedy administration, especially Johnson, like just a great, this sort of special relationship as we know it, the affinity for Israel in American Judaism and amongst American Christians really solidifies. I don't want to overemphasize the book and film Exodus, which were huge blockbusters in sort of telling the Americanizing the Israeli story, but I think it embodies sort of a shift in mentality that's happening right at this time. So I think Israel is sort of this, for the first decade, it's not unpopular, but it's this weird thing that like, okay, Jewish state exists, like how do we deal with that? And in the next decade, from 58 to 67-ish, like it's becoming something that's more big in American Jewish culture and American culture and more positive. And then 67 happens and it sort of gets hyper done. But that whole story, that whole 48 to 67 trajectory often is neglected by many historians up until now. I mean, not everyone, Emily Katz, a lot, but in terms of until relatively recently.
Now, you mentioned earlier chapter 4, and this is a very interesting chapter and discussion. This chapter is dedicated essentially to anti-Semitism, an issue that unfortunately doesn't seem to have evolved much since the events discussed in the book. For instance, accusations that university campuses harbor anti-Semites are similar whether made in the 1950s or today. Obviously, there's a lot of differences in the political discourse, but the accusation is very similar. Can you give us a sense of how anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism came to be blended together? Because once again, this is not just a contemporary discourse, but is one that goes back decades. And I would also like you to mention Eliyahu Epstein, perhaps an unknown figure for many, but a very important one in sort of setting the tone in this discourse, and his work, which I believe has misinformed the public for generations to come.
Okay, so there are lots of big things. So first, I wish I included stuff more from my article I published in an Arab Studies journal, which deals with Arab student activism. It overlaps with the book, but there's also more there on this question. So it's 57, the first time like Arab student groups, which are anti-Zionist, are criticized publicly in New York Times by the ADL. And soon after, you have a congressman who's calling on Arab students to be expelled, investigated at the very least. And so this is 57, 58, again, this time period. And I can't find anything like that big of a deal before then. And I don't think anyone else has really been, one other person, one or two other scholars have been dealing with this, but it's not been really out that much. So it happens that they're not saying investigate them because they're anti-Semites. They're saying investigate them because they're a problem for American Cold War interests. So, and that's a really important distinction. So the ADL is actually criticizing these groups, not because they're anti-Semitic, sometimes because they feel like these groups will fuel anti-Semitism through anti-Semites will use the criticism of Israel to advance their, but they're not saying anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is bad for America in the Cold War, which again looks at the right-left issues football today, and they're saying sometimes that, okay, anti-Zionism is this, and it's going to be used against Jews because far right-wing anti-Semites are using, some of this Arab material, even though to make a case against Jews. And ADL and other groups make a lot of that, which isn't relevant. So it's very interesting, and I kind of trace things in this book and a couple other articles that I've written in the 30s. Basically, even though some American Jews from early on do think anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, the establishment does not before World War II. And that seems pretty clear to me in the 30s. And there's a lot to unpack there. And you can look at my article on this. And then World War II happens. The whole Mufti collaboration a lot is made of that with the fascists and with Hitler. And it's important, and a lot of stuff that's going on in Jewish politics and embrace of Zionism and embrace of support for Jewish statehood because of the Holocaust and the rep posts, the displaced person issue. And so you have American Jewish groups who are responding very negatively to anti-Zionist activism, but aren't inherently calling anti-Semitism. They're saying, maybe some of these people are fueled by anti-Semitism, maybe some of these people are, but it's a distinction from what you see later. Like they're saying that there's a connection, but they're not linking it in the same, they're not making an explicit statement. And then after 67, you sort of see a transformation where this term, the new anti-Semitism, comes about that sort of looks at sort of left-wing pro-Palestine rhetoric as something that's inherently sort of really part of the anti-Semitism discourse. And, it's like, is it inherent? Is it usually? Now you're seeing the discussions about that. But basically, what I do is I don't make conclusions about what anti-Semitism is or what anti-Semitism isn't, but I historicize this in a way that I don't think many people have, and in the American setting, in my books and articles. You asked about Epstein. So he's not the only one. He's, the first ambassador. There's a lot of Israeli diplomats, plus a guy named Joseph Shetman, who writes a book on the Arab refugees that comes out before Peretz's. And the case that is made that you're referring to is that all the Arabs who became refugees, all the Palestinian refugees, fled their home and were told to leave by other Arabs. And we see that's not true. We see that, a good chunk of Palestinian refugees were forced from their homes. We don't see this evidence, obviously, of this mass push of people, Arabs calling them to leave. But it became orthodoxy really early on in American Jewish knowledge. And so Peretz, people who don't like Peretz are saying, how can he say that he doesn't have evidence of these things? Like, doesn't he know this is how it is? And Peretz is the expert. He was there, and he's getting doubted because this narrative is pushed through very, very quickly, including like very early on that, because Mizrahi Jews are coming in, that sort of makes the Palestinian refugee issue settled. So it's amazing how quickly these discourses and how much they resemble stuff that you'll see today came up at in 49, 50, 52. And the die is just kind of set for what is correct information about what happened.
Now that you mentioned Mizrahi Jews, I thought about this question, but I was not entirely sure about it. Your book really highlights the fact that most of the American Jewish organizations were run and led by Ashkenazi Jews. And I was wondering if you ever come across any Mizrahi Jew in America with some public role, given that Peretz is actually Sephardi Jews. So there's a distinction there, and to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, Peretz is a great example of someone who is, of Middle Eastern or half of Middle Eastern, or whatever you would call it, someone whose family spent 500, 400 years there. But there's not a lot. I mean, it's established. It's maybe some people have some Sephardic roots. A guy named Lazaron, who I opened up the chapter with, is Sephardic, but not Mizrahi. No, I mean, there's not a strong contingent of people with influence. There's a guy named El Yashar, who I'm interested in, who did some stuff. But again, I think he's of, Eretz Israel, maybe of Sephardic. But this is an Ashkenazi establishment, and it still is to a lot of ways in America. But a big part of that's sheer numbers, frankly. It's not, especially during this time period. My next, big shout out for my next project is going to be American Jewish engagement with Mizrahi, Middle Eastern Jewish issues from the 40s to 70s. So, any scholars should be in touch about that thing, because that's fascinating for me. And there's some sort of engagement with these questions, but not by people who are of the region themselves.
Yeah, that's a fascinating topic. Obviously, looking forward to the book, given that Mizrahis are slowly regaining a position certainly in Israel, in Israeli society, given again the sheer number of now they represent in Israel. But that's a discussion for another day. And I want to move forward, talk about one of the few women that are mentioned in the book, and I found her fascinating. Dorothy Thompson. She's a famous journalist who radically changed her views on Israel after a trip around the country. And that reminded me of a contemporary journalist, Peter Beinart, who was an ardent Zionist, pro-Israel supporter of the New York Times, who underwent a similar process, has become, in the last few years, a very vocal critic of Israel. So can you just tell us a little bit more about Dorothy Thompson?
Yeah, she's one of the most popular columnists in America, like top 3 or top 5. She is the second most respected woman in the country in a certain poll after Eleanor Roosevelt. But again, that almost underwrites her because she's such an important columnist. Early critic of Hitler in the 30s. She is a hero to the American Jewish community. She takes on Zionism. She is one of the most outspoken pro-Zionist voices in early to mid 40s. And then she goes over there, and she, in the course of a couple of years, there's a few articles by Corinne Walther and another scholar, Walker Robbins, on this shift. And she goes, 180, and she becomes, within a few years, one of the most outspoken pro-Palestinian voices, narrates the first movie documentary on refugees. You can see it on YouTube, Sands of Sorrow. And becomes involved in this sort of network of people who are talking about these issues, and becomes very, very unpopular amongst Jewish organizations, except for the anti-Zionist American Council for Judaism, which highlights her, and she says controversial stuff that they like, but that makes her, when she says it as a non-Jew, it's viewed as anti-Semitic because it's pretty edgy stuff about just the nature of what Jewish loyalties and stuff. So I even view it as problematic, frankly. But it's an amazing trajectory from going to someone who's so loved in American Jewish politics to someone who's so hated. And she becomes head of this CA-funded American Friends of the Middle East. And, her and Sayegh, people don't really, know Sayegh's not a household name, but she's sort of this household name who is the face of it. And it ruins her, it embitters her, because she's subject to levels of attack by people that she'd been friends with, and it's rough. It's interesting, the women in the story before the 70s, when there were women more active, are often either Israeli, like these diplomats, the diplomat who's against Paris is Israel, or they're Zionist, or they're non-Jewish. So she's non-Jewish, and it's interesting that this cast of characters of anti-Zionist and non-Zionist that I mostly focus on, they're not as good as sort of working women in, allowing women to be part of the movements as the Zionists, because Hadassah is, of course, becoming this big thing. So if you want to talk about why Zionism succeeded, I think you need to look about where women were allowed to, really have a great role, and where they aren't. So it's fascinating, Thompson, both the absence of women in groups like the AJC.
Now, the last 2 chapters are fascinating. At least I believe they can provide the basis to understand current trends in both Israeli and American politics in relation to Israel. So I want to straight go to the question, why would anti-Zionists support Israel?
So the American Council for Judaism, and sometimes it's called the ACJ, which is super confusing because it's not the AJC. It's anti-Zionist. It's kind of an offshoot of classical reform anti-Zionists that basically say Jews are not a nation. Jews are not a nation. Jews are a religion, and we're a religion, and we don't affiliate with this movement. And so they emerged in the 40s, early 40s, when the Holocaust is becoming news, and when more American Jews are supporting Jewish statehood. And that's why they're focused. They're afraid of anti-Semitism coming out of this. They think that, okay, when Israel does something bad, American Jews will pay the price, so we need to disaffiliate from this. And they just feel like they don't want Judaism, so they push against Israel's creation, trying to nudge Truman against it in 48. They fail, And that's sort of where the story, people think the story ends. But they continue in the 50s, and their focus is keeping American Jewish religious life the same, like not having Israeli culture, Hava Nagila, like all these things that they think are foreign, Israeli pronunciation of Hebrew, like all this Israeli cultural influence in American Jewish life, they're pushing back against it. And they're traditional people in this sense, and they're often these people are temperamentally conservative. And so, and they don't want the Zionist push for pro-Israel foreign policy to hurt American foreign policy. They don't want anyone to think that Jews are putting Israel first in terms of American foreign policy questions. And so some of them actually, Ben-Gurion and American Jewish Israeli diplomats understand that these aren't people who are focused on Israel. They're focused on American Jewish questions. And so they actually try to meet and co-opt some of them. And they meet with the chairman, and Ben-Gurion spends hours and hours with him. And so they end up winning some of them over. The executive figure, vice president, director, vice president, Berger ends up becoming friends with Sayegh and goes in the other direction, becomes very pro-Palestinian. But a lot of these anti-Zionists end up feeling like Israel's okay. And then once the Christians have embraced Israel, and once American foreign policy and Johnston have embraced Israel, why not? They don't really care about the Palestinians, some of these anti-Zionists. So they kind of drop that, and so there are people who don't believe in Jewish nationhood. There are people who don't want to speak Israeli Sephardic Hebrew, but who don't lose their reason for opposing Zionism. So Elmer Berger, the pro-Palestine figure in this group, is sort of pushed out with some of his followers. And so he, after 67, is on his own talking about this. And this is also when you have a new wave of people like Noam Chomsky and sort of left-wing Jewish critiques. You have groups like Merip, which includes Jews, like secular, sort of pro-Palestine oriented organizations. My book is more focused on Jewish politics, but there's lots of Jews after 67 who are supportive of Palestinian rights who are operating outside of the Jewish political spectrum. And Michael Fischbach's written about some of these people. So I end chapter with that, 5 with that, and then in 6 I go into sort of the Jewish politics of this. And you have people who are advocating for the two-state solution, what we now call the two-state solution, out of a place of sometimes Zionism. And so chapter 5 is anti-Zionist for Israel, chapter 6 is Zionist for Palestine, because some of these people who are pushing for, Israel controls the territories, and so they think that the pro-Israel and pro-Jewish position is Palestinian statehood, which you'll be familiar with if you've paid attention to anything that's gone on in Jewish politics in recent decades. But that's something that emerges after 67. Peretz is kind of a senior figure who's involved in that, but it's really the younger kind of baby boomer generation who's leading it, Brera.
And that's what I wanted to ask, because, then you have this title, which is fascinating, Zionist for Palestine, where you focus on this organization, Brera, which in Hebrew means choice. And I was wondering if you can just, speak a little bit more about who are the Zionists for Palestine, and also what is Brera, and what are the goals of this organization?
Yeah, not everyone in Brera, just want to mention, not everyone in Brera is Zionist, not everyone would call themselves for Palestine, and same with the other chapter, not all the anti-Zionists are for Israel. But, there's the people who found this group in 73, 74 are people who are very Jewishly engaged, very Jewishly educated. A lot of them spend time in Israel or meet people in the West Bank and basically get enchanted by the Israeli left. Some of them are Jewish studies scholars who are in their 70s now. You'll see some names, Ayn Lustig, David Beal. And they come to the view that some on the Israeli left are beginning to articulate, that Israel needs to deal with this Palestinian issue, that it can't occupy these lands forever, that the answer is negotiations, that the answer is autonomy or really probably statehood. And so there's this idea that Brera, this first group, is this oh, it's this huge critique. It's these people distancing, people who don't understand Judaism or care about this, that they're getting influenced by the left, the new left, and these, Chomsky. And really, they're influenced by Israel. They're influenced by what they see over there. They're influenced by their understanding of Judaism. And so they become a vocal group of, not a huge membership. 1,500 is one number I've seen, but they're very active amongst people who are running Hillels, people who are sort of in their 20s and 30s, and this young Havurah movement, and people who are very engaged in Jewish life. And they do okay for a few years. And then their sort of heroes, Mati Peled, the kind of offshoot Israeli left, start actually negotiating with the PLO. And so a couple of their people are in this meeting, not just them, with two PLO moderates, a guy named Sabri Jirius. She just, who's still alive. I just sent him my book because I interviewed him, Issam Sertawi. And it gets leaked by Israeli diplomats that there was this meeting, and all the other people at the meeting, the organizations they work for, the ADL, the B'nai B'rith, AJC, they say these meetings, we disavow this meeting. The PLO is a problem. They should be isolated. And Beraa responds, again, this wasn't its leaders exactly at the meeting, Max Tickton and Arthur Waskow, but they say, no, we can't disavow the idea of meeting with the PLO moderates. And so they become this even more of a lightning rod. And there's this campaign against them. It's still kind of shadowy. And they really get, there's financial reasons that are compounded by these controversies that they fold in 77, 78. So I really try to internationalize this story. It's part of Israeli left history. It's part of Palestinian history. And so again, I approach this whole project as first a scholar of Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East, and then rather than approaching it from American Jewish history first. And so I kind of have a new angle. So unlike these other stories I tell, chapter 7, people know about Beraa. I mean, historians know about Beraa. I just sort of tell the story differently by showing that it's the end point of this broader engagement. Like it pivots into the modern engagement where you have terms like two-state solution, post-67. So, and there's a lot more people involved. And female voices, which I try to highlight there because I can't as much in the 50s, unfortunately.
So lastly, can you draw some conclusion about our Palestine question?
Some conclusion. Well, I outlined sort of my main takeaways, but I think oftentimes the American Jews who have gotten engaged and involved in these Palestinian issues have done so not from distance to Israel and Zionism, but by spending time over there and meeting Israelis. And I can say that I don't do sociological studies of the present, but I can say historically that, these have been people who've gone over there and have been won over by the Israeli left, even when they're fringe left. And there are people who've often been very invested in Jewish life and Jewish questions. So that's a big one. 2 is that that's clashed with often Israeli state interest, or what the people who are involved in Israel, running the Israel state, have viewed as their interest. Obviously, it's hard to say what are Israeli interests, what are Jewish interests, what are American Jewish interests, and are these different than Israeli interests? I don't have a conclusion about that, but I think, I really want people to think more deeply about, what's Jewish safety, what's Jewish interest, are these issues, are the goals and interests of different Jewish communities always the same? And what does it mean if you gloss those over all the time? Lastly, I think chapter 4 in Steig is important. He's this figure who's, people are starting to understand that he's a huge intellectual figure. But in this sort of conversations in the 50s, I'm able to show that these are hard questions. How does a Palestinian advocate for himself and his cause without being accused of anti-Semitic? And he grapples with that, and I show that in a real way. And I show how the American Jewish groups are sort of end up in the position they are, even though some of them didn't want to resisted sort of labeling in a way that and pushing against him. So I just think that just shows the complexity to these conversations, because you're able to go into archival sources, because you're able to show who people actually are, rather than, just sound bites and, and yeah, so I guess I don't know if those are conclusions, but those are things that I'm thinking about and that I, hope people will be thinking about when they read the book.
This was Geoffrey Levin, author of Our Palestine Question, Israel and American Jewish Dissent, 1948 to 1978, published by Yale University Press in 2023. Geoffrey, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Grazie.